Although no action has been taken yet by China to follow through with that course of action, so we're going to continue to monitor that. The big question is, how likely is China to get more directly involved in this conflict? How much do they want to be heavily involved versus maybe just kind of nudging it along a little bit? How would the U.S. and other allies respond if China were to take such definitive action on lethal aid or deadly force, however you want to put that? And what effect would the Chinese backing actually have on the war? What help would it actually give to Russia? What difference would it make in terms of the battle itself? So let's dig into it. The president gave his thoughts about how likely China would start becoming more directly involved in the war by supporting Russia.
I don't anticipate, we haven't seen it yet, but I don't anticipate a major initiative on the part of China providing weaponry to Russia.
But if they did, would that be crossing a line for you, Mr. President?
It would be the same line everyone else would have crossed. In other words, we impose severe sanctions on anyone who has done that.
So there would be serious consequences?
I'll let you characterize what they would be. We would respond.
So a little bit of a soft shoe there by the president at the end. I was a little surprised by that. The president's been pretty definitive in terms of kind of the red line that would be in terms of Russia providing force, the sanctions that would follow. And so I was actually a little surprised by his response there that at first he was quite strong, saying, hey, I don't think this is going to happen. But then when he was pushed to say, well, what would the United States do if China was to provide Russia with support? And he soft-shooted a little bit. Serious sanctions, but wouldn't go so far as saying definitively what would happen and how that would play out. So I think that's interesting. I think that's a little confusing from the president. He's been much stronger previously, so I'm not sure why he soft-shoed on that particular one. CIA Director William Burns appeared on Face the Nation yesterday and gave his insight to reporter Margaret Brennan about the U.S. intelligence regarding China's consideration for providing weapons to Russia.
Well, we're confident that the Chinese leadership is considering the provision of lethal equipment. We also don't see that a final decision has been made yet, and we don't see evidence of actual shipments of lethal equipment. And that's why I think Secretary Blinken and the President have thought it important to make very clear what the consequences of that would be as well.
To deter it.
Yeah, to deter it, because it would be a very risky and unwise bet.
So much more definitive there in terms of, look, we know they're considering it. We have not seen evidence that it has happened yet, but we know from the intelligence community that they are clearly at least having conversations about it and what that might look like and how China might navigate it in terms of an international communication strategy to what they're thinking about doing. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was also on Face the Nation over the weekend and made statements regarding China's consideration of that lethal aid to Russia.
Well, look, the U.S. position in this conflict is straightforward. We're not going to stand by and allow one country to roll over another country and try to wipe it off the mat. China's position in this is much more awkward. In fact, there was just a vote at the UN General Assembly in which China abstained. They did not vote with Russia. When China talks rhetorically about the war in Ukraine, they tie themselves into knots because they know that going all in with Russia in this war in Ukraine would alienate a substantial number of countries that they are working hard to maintain good relations with. This war presents real complications for Beijing, and Beijing will have to make its own decisions about how it proceeds, whether it provides military assistance. But if it goes down that road, it will come at real cost to China, and I think China's leaders are weighing that as they make their decision.
Very definitive there by Jake Sullivan. I actually think that's the best conversation coming out of the White House in terms of what the position is. And I think some of the nuances to what Jake Sullivan said there are also critically important, that China doesn't want to be in the middle of this. As Jake Sullivan pointed out, they're trying to foster relationships with a lot of other places around the world that are also important to them strategically. And so they have to be careful in terms of how they navigate that. Now, would they like for the war to maybe continue on longer, a slow slog? I think China benefits from that as long as they're not in the middle of it. And I think that's what Jake Sullivan was pointing out there, is that it really is an interesting space for China. China's got a lot of challenges at home that they've got to deal with in terms of their own economy, their own citizenry, their own defense capabilities. But I think they're all too happy to see the West, NATO, use up a lot of their resources And I even think China's okay with Russia using a lot of their resources. So it depletes everybody, and by de facto, it makes China just a little bit stronger. Jake Sullivan was also asked how soon China could start providing weapons and shipments to Russia of that lethal aid. He clarified that no aid is on the way. So again, confirming what the intelligence community has been saying. He said there is something being considered in Beijing, but from everything they can tell, no final decision has been made.
The other thing that Director Burns, Bill Burns of the CIA, said was that we haven't seen them do it yet. We actually haven't seen them take a final decision to provide the aid to Russia, and we haven't seen the aid be provided to Russia. So we will watch carefully, we will be vigilant, and we will continue to send a strong message that we believe that sending military aid to Russia at this time, when they are using their weapons to bombard cities, kill civilians, and commit atrocities, would be a bad mistake, and China should want no part of it.
In an interview with David Murph on ABC, this was on Friday of last week, President Biden, in this sit-down interview, characterized the conversation and conversations he's had with President Xi of China regarding what the consequences might be if China starts supplying Russia with that lethal aid.
I had a very frank conversation with President Xi this past summer on this issue. And I pointed out to him, I said, Mr. President, this is not a threat, it's just an assertion, a statement of what I think the reality is. You saw what happened when the rest of the world, Europe in particular, saw the brutality of what Putin was doing in Ukraine to the Ukrainians from Russia. And I said, without any government prodding, 600 American corporations left Russia, from McDonald's to Exxon to across the board. And I said, and if you are engaged in this same kind of brutality by supporting the brutality that's going on, I said, you may face the same consequence.
Now, those are strong words from the president. So much more clear in that interview than he was in some others over the weekend. Clearly saying that, look, China is weighing and debating whether they should send things like drones and ammunition to Russia for the war in Ukraine. And President Biden was very clear in terms of his conversations with President Xi in terms of what that might mean, referencing that many of the American companies that were doing business in Russia, including places like McDonald's, pulled out because of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Also interesting, just to note, Politico reported this, that earlier this month, the U.S. sanctioned a slew of Chinese companies for supporting Russia's aggression in Ukraine, including a satellite company called Spacity that the administration says provided imagery to Moscow for use by their deadly force, the Wagner Group. Now, all of that, of course, is just a fascinating backdrop to see how this plays out as we get to spring. We know of spring offensives coming from Vladimir Putin. We know that President Zelensky in Ukraine is preparing their own offensives for spring as well. Who has the ammunition and the firepower and the strategy to carry it out is going to be very interesting. But it is clear that Russia is struggling. And the question then becomes, does China tip the scale? Do they weigh in with drones and with ammunition and other lethal aid, which I just will keep calling deadly force, that would clearly help Russia as they continue to prosecute their invasion of Ukraine and their desire to take over that portion of the country. So the big question then becomes, where does it go next? The intelligence community is going to continue to do their part to make sure they're understanding what China will do and when they will do it. And then, of course, sanctions will likely be the first move, and that will be our indication from the public that China has crossed at least some line. It may not be a bright red line, but it will be a line, and sanctions will be the first thing that I think we will see. As we've been covering the war over the course of the past year, of course, much of it has been communication strategy, both deployed by Vladimir Putin inside of Russia and what President Zelensky has been doing in Ukraine and around the world, and really talk about a tale of two different universes. And Rob has done just a fascinating deep dive on CNN.com that really looks at this universe inside of Russia. And Rob, can you start by giving us just a sense of what has been going on during this first year of the war?
Hi, Boyd. Sure. Thanks for having me on. This first year of the war back home in Russia has really been defined in large parts by Putin's attempts to control what Russians are seeing and hearing and thinking about the war. So within the first few weeks of his invasion, he passed really dramatic and draconian new censorship laws targeting any independent media. It's led to a situation where it is very difficult now, even more so than before the war, to find dissenting views and anti-war views on Russian media. And that's having an effect on the population. It's meant that support for the war has generally remained high. But as I found when I was reporting this piece, that there's also a lot of confusion, a lot of apathy, and certainly some opposition across Russia. And a lot of Russians are growing tired of the pretty relentless state-controlled media narrative.
Yeah, and I want to dig into several of those components that you raised there, Rob. And let's start with kind of the broad sense in terms of just kind of the fatigue factor of the citizens and what they're being served up as it relates to the war.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a year of very, very relentless. If anyone who's seen clips from Russian state news media might have a sense of it, but really, it's the views there, and some of the most popular pundits are incredibly hawkish, incredibly pro-war, advocating in some cases, some of the most extreme possible outcomes in Ukraine. And Russia is a country where 2/3 of the population, thereabouts, do get their news primarily from those TV sources. It's had an effect, and certainly it's converted some people. It's kept support for the war relatively high, according to what we can tell from opinion polls there. But people are growing tired. There's a lot of apathy as well in Russia, and a lot of people just have tuned out. They don't watch this kind of output anymore, according to what some Russians told us for this story.
Yeah, let's drill into that a little bit on this indifference front, because I find that so fascinating that the indifference is obviously a great advantage to Vladimir Putin and those who are driving that narrative. Is it just that they're wearing people out, or have people just realized it's impossible to do anything? What's your sense there?
Certainly. I mean, a few of the people we spoke to and a few experts who watch Russia very closely as well all reported a similar thing, which is that a lot of people just feel, what's the point of opposing? What's the point? It's not worth the risk to go to an anti-war protest, for example, or to be particularly vocal about the views about the war if they're not supportive, because nothing will really change. I mean, there's a kind of understanding across the population, it seems, that there's not much possibility for ordinary Russians to have much of an impact on what the Kremlin is doing. And that definitely suits Putin very well, as you said. I mean, we've seen some scenes of anti-war protests, but they are rare and they're noteworthy when they happen, but it's certainly not the norm.
Yeah. Leads me to one of the pieces, components that you had in your piece, Rob, and that is this culture of silence. And I wanted to ask you, we've covered some that there's somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million, a lot of tech folks from Russia that have left the country. So some people talk about that in terms of the brain drain, in terms of a long-term impact on the economy. But there's also a flip side to that many of these are younger people and people who could actually shift the narrative or to help transform the government over time. How do you see that balance, and what do you think is happening, again, both with those leaving and pursuing careers and freedom other places, and what impact that has in terms of having anyone left who actually can protest or raise a dissenting voice?
Well, we have seen an exodus, as you say, across the past year, particularly around the time in September where Putin announced this partial mobilization of Russian citizens. And certainly those who stay in Russia, I've talked about this kind of sense of apathy. There's not a lot of protest. There's not a lot of dissent. But I think if there was to be a change, I mean, it's hard to envisage if you're looking at how tightly controlled the media is. But something else that came across is that those who have remained in Russia are starting to feel the effects of the war themselves. Whether it's because they know Ukrainians who they speak to, or they have children or relatives who are of the age that they might be called up. We spoke to a woman who lost her job. Prices are going up as a result of Western sanctions. So if there is to be a slow shift in opinion and a swing against Putin, then I imagine that it might be those sorts of things, those personal impacts on those who have remained in Russia that might force it.
Yeah, you also reported, Rob, that there are some cracks starting to appear in that information blockade from Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, and sometimes that can be as simple as turning off the news and having private conversations with friends and colleagues expressing doubt about the war. But there certainly is the sense that although support for the war does remain high, and it's important to stress that, this is not a population that has become anti-war in the space of a year, not at all. But there is a kind of cocktail of different opinions in Russia. There's apathy, there's doubt, there's anxiety, and all of that is which is particularly noticeable in younger people in cities, people who are accessing international news sources online and who know how to get around the Kremlin's blocks. That's not ideal for the Kremlin. That's not what the kind of society they're trying to create with their control of the media. But it's a long way away from seeing whether that can have a kind of concrete impact in forcing a move from Putin.
That apathy, doubt, and anxiety. Apathy, doubt, and anxiety. Those are tools of thugs, bad guys, and dictators for centuries as they try to control the narrative, as they try to control the headlines. Obviously, they're controlling speech, they're controlling thought. And if they can do that with this cocktail that Rob has introduced us to of apathy, doubt, and anxiety, it prevents anyone from leading any kind of counter claim or counter train of thought. And to me, that's all the challenge. And this is one of those that allows us to go a little bit deeper in terms of what is going on. I think so many of us are so interested in what is going on inside of Russia. What do the Russian people really know? And what do they really believe? Rob pointed out that there is so much silence in Russia. Everyone is afraid to protest beyond just, maybe a word here or there. Many are afraid to even say what they think or feel or doubts that they might have for fear that they're going to be punished by the government or sent to prison or sent to some retraining camp somewhere so they can be aligned with Vladimir Putin. And so it's beyond the head. It's the ultimate in think again. You look at the headlines and you have to get to what really comes next. And so we're going to stay with the conversation and continue my conversation with Rob Pachetta. Rob is a news producer for CNN Digital Worldwide. He's based in London, joins us today. And this is just such an important conversation in terms of the people of Russia, what's going on inside. As we continue the conversation, we'll talk about the young people of Russia and one of those small cracks that is developing within YouTube, which is still permitted